Well, hello and welcome to this auDA webinar looking at the Internet of Things, or IoT. I am Michael Lewis, auDA's Industry Relations Manager. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I am coming to you from today, the original home of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Please note this session is being recorded. Well, I don't know about you, but I certainly have a lot more internet connected devices around my house than I used to. The IoT devices seem to be everywhere and spreading rapidly, solving problems and automating new parts of our lives. I think a few years ago, we never envisaged we needed automation or solving. But with all these devices and new connections, data collection points and data storage, we need to start asking some serious questions about privacy, security and user education. What is listening? What access do these devices have? Where is my data being stored? What do users need to think about when choosing a device? Well, thankfully, to take us through all this, we're joined by the founding CEO of the IoT Alliance of Australia, Frank Zeichner. The IoT Alliance is the peak body driving collaboration across industry, research, government, and community to improve Australia's competitiveness and the lives of Australians. Frank brings 40 years of industry experience across telecommunications, operations and other areas to today's discussion. Frank has a presentation to share with us and then has agreed to take some of my questions and yours and take us through the world of IoT. So if you do have any questions, please drop them in the Zoom Q&A tab during Frank's presentation and after, and we'll get to as many as we can. Frank, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Michael, and welcome to everybody. I'm very pleased to share a discussion around IoT. It's a huge, pervasive suite of technologies that is going to pretty much transform everything we do and continue to do so beyond our lifetimes, undoubtedly. So it's pretty important that we think about it. So I've got a presentation, and I apologize that in a way that it's a presentation because it's impossible to summarize IoT, its effect, its the issues around it, the technology, the standards, the ethical implications in 45 minutes. Just impossible. So I'll narrow it, and I'll be relatively high level, I suppose. But I'm really encouraged low-level questions, and I'm going to try and dive into things that will open up some practical examples to be meaningful. And I really welcome you to ask me questions on any aspect of it. So I'll set the sharing up now. Okay, how's that, Michael? It's good. Okay.
Good. Looks good.
Fantastic. Okay. Let me just work out how to move the slides along. I've not been able to use the technology. Good. Oh, there we are. Okay, just use the mouse. That's pretty smart. Okay, so as Michael mentioned, I'm the CEO of the peak industry body for the Internet of Things Australia, and our mission is to build a better society and economy through the use of accessible, trusted, real-time data powered by the Internet of Things technology. What does that sort of mean? Well, just sort of imagine that we can use the data from anything, pretty much. So we know the data of the state of the building, or the temperature of the air, or how many people went through here in the last 2 days, or any of those metrics and figures will be accessible in the future at some stage. Some of it's accessible right now. We tend to think about it as collected by internet devices, and when I think of internet device, what comes to my head is some chunky thing, In the future, they will be almost invisible, they'll just be embedded, the concrete pillars will just have them come along with them, and they'll be just generated. The data will come along when you pass by with a detector or whatever that is. So just think of the future world of the data environment just growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. So that's that has massive implications. To try and wrap our heads around how we deal with that, the Alliance has 4 focus areas. One is IoT for good. It's something that we've only really sort of cottoned onto in the last year or two. And that's because of the evident effect that such pervasive data and such pervasive automation of data and decision-making through data has on our society, on our life. We need to be conscious of what that might be. And I just want to pick out a little interesting, we have an annual event called the IoT Impact Event. We have it's an all-day things, exhibition, etc. Next one's in May in Sydney. We had a brilliant speaker from overseas who's written a book called Technology is Not Neutral. And that's because, everyone, the old story, guns are not neutral, don't kill people, people kill people. So is IoT neutral or not? Well, the way we think about IoT for good is, what is neutral? Are we neutral now? Is accelerating what we're doing now neutral, or is it not neutral? So the question of what is neutral and whether it's good or not is actually a valid question to make when you're implementing technology. And the other aspect of IoT is that it's designed by humans. The AI engines and algorithms and weightings are designed by humans and therefore are not neutral. They are predetermined in some fashion, understood by the people who designed it, but not necessarily by the people who use it. So IoT for good matters. Our Australian IoT capability, which is vital for us to understand and to be in control of our IoT destiny, absolutely vital for our national resilience, for our economy, and for building the sort of trusted environment that we need. Security, which is massive. Once you start opening all the doors, there are many ways in which they can be entered, and we need to understand the risk profiling what we do. And interoperability, which is how do we build or how do we not build little islands of isolated costs that then have a transformation problem. And that's a biggie, that's huge. We do that through 13 work streams. 8 of them are sectoral. So we look at transport, energy, water, smart places and infrastructure, construction, food and ag, health. And we also have a number of work streams on the enabling aspects, including security and technology, data frameworks, etc. So I'm going to use the fourth industrial revolution term because that's a well understood, not well understood, but it's certainly a zeitgeisty type thing. That industrial revolution, the automation of things, the way we do things, is utterly underpinned by the Internet of Things, utterly independent, utterly driven by the data we collect and how we process it. So it's key to digital transformation. And I've just pulled a couple of figures out to sort of not have me just say it, even though I evidently believe it. But Forrester, a little while ago, and that's 2 years ago, so it's accelerated by the way since COVID. 36% of European IT initiatives, it was 34 in the US, are focused on expanding IoT. 34, that's a third, that's big. So they're collecting data and using it. McKinsey's updated their forecast of the value it will generate, and that's not the cost of the IoT, but the actual value that it creates, productivity it generates, cost savings that it makes, wastage that it reduces, in the trillions. It's massive, utterly ridiculously big. So pretty important to our future. And CSIRO basically said a third, and we increase our GDP by a third if we embrace technology and digitization. And I read that as pretty much a lot of it's around IoT. So pretty important, pretty transformational in every sense, our lives, personal, public, otherwise. So I thought I'd just do a one, what is IoT? Because you get many definitions, and I thought I'd just go back to the source. That's the International Standards Organization. And it's not a technology, it is an infrastructure, a suite of technologies that interconnects objects, people, systems, information resources with intelligent services. So in other words, it includes AI, ML, allows them to process information, simulate, etc., of the physical world and the virtual into the virtual world and react. So it's not about collecting and looking at a screen. It's actually then automating and reacting and alerting. So it's a systemic end-to-end thing. So when you have your internet connected kettle that might be useful to the kettle manufacturer that tells you, when you need to change, well, I don't know if you change elements nowadays, but when it might need to be maintained or whatever it is, but it also gives information about when people actually use their kettle. It actually are they in their home? A whole lot of information that's now gathered that are secondary effects that are, by the way, being used by the health industry in terms of looking at propensity for people to be isolated or otherwise, if they're not getting out of bed, for example, a whole lot of things like that. So to reiterate, it's about inputs from the physical world, and I mean every input. That means state, the state, i.e. is it on, is it off, but also is it wet, is it cold, is it hot, is it moving, is it whatever, and we put it into this virtual world, and then we process it. Now, one of the instantiations of that processing is another concept that I just going to quickly throw at you, and they're not explained it at all, is digital twins. This is where we actually provide a sort of a virtual twin of the physical world thing that we're looking at, the process or wherever it is. And Boeing's been doing that for their jet engines for years. They have 100,000 sensors, and they know exactly what a jet engine does, how it performs over its life cycle, it affects its maintenance, and it affects its future design. That is the archetypal digital twin. But the digital twins now of cities, of stadiums, are now starting to be talked about. They're not nowhere near in place, and the definitions of them are still being worked on, and the international standards are still being worked on. But ultimately, it's about that and how it affects the physical world again. So it doesn't sit in the virtual world. It goes and backs and actually has an effect. It sends out alerts or whatever. And I put in industrial IoT and consumer IoT advisedly in this list, because we've been traditionally thinking about IoT as industrial processes, improving production lines and whatever, and it is. It's also about monitoring the air quality and sending out alerts if the air quality is bad, or turning off, smokestacks or whatever that is. But it's also consumer IoT, where you're using your Alexa, or you've got your baby monitor, or you're actually monitoring the air quality in your own home yourself, that you might want to share. And in the future industrial revolution, it won't be the industrials that will be deriving the data. It'll be the consumers. That is the big shift that we're not even near yet, but in 10 or 20 years, the bulk of the data is coming from the consumers. Probably is now. It's not being used by the industry yet. That merging of individuals and business, that's our future world. Just wanted to blow your mind a little on that before we go further. Okay. So from a technology point of view, I sort of touched on it briefly. It's sensors, actuators, hardware. Think of devices, but when you think of devices, think of sensors within devices. So your phone probably has 20, 30 sensors in it. It's not, so there are many data sources, but one device. So there's a different way of thinking of the technology. And those sensors are separately managed in terms of data flows, although from a communications point of view, they may not be. So there's a whole lot of connectivity options, and they're going through the roof. They're heaps. The great news is the cost of sensors is going down ridiculously. The cost of connectivity is going down ridiculously. We still have a big problem in Australia for coverage in remote areas. I mean, low Earth orbiting satellites and stuff are helping, but that's changing a lot. But as we collect more of this data, this thing called edge computing is becoming really important, which means we're gathering so much data, especially when it's video data, and cameras are IoT devices, by the way. The processing of that data will need to happen more and more at the edge. That edge might be at the local exchange or something, but it might actually even be in the device itself. So the edge is the device. And so you're processing, so you'll have a very, very smart device. And your phone is one of those examples. It's like an edge. And then you have very, 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 very dumb sensors, which probably send maybe a bit of data a day or a month or a year, use no batteries, maybe no batteries at all, and just get activated by motion, for example. So you have a full range of those sort of sensors. Then there's a whole host of IoT platforms that's all around the actual management of the devices. And when you have hundreds and thousands and millions of devices, managing where they are, who belongs to them, and how you maintain them is non-trivial problem that we are only just starting to scratch the surface of. Not to mention the product stewardship of it, which means we got a lot of landfill to fix up and a lot of recycling to be done. So we're creating a problem that we have to fix as well. Data management, utterly ridiculously massive. And why is it different? Because all this data that's coming in is much more real time. It's much more now. It's much more date stamped, time stamped, location stamped, in a way that old data, slow data, hasn't been. And so the types of databases you're using, the way in which you're putting metadata around them is different. So there's a huge revolution in the data side of it. And then on the application side, this is when you're actually affecting the outcome, where you're actually creating the opportunity for making decisions. You're automating processes, you're turning sprinklers on and off, you're alerting people that the baby's crying or whatever that is. And it includes robotics as well. It actually goes all the way to, automatically, picking, weeding in the right places, for example, in a field. So full technology chain. We have a number of tools within IoT Alliance that we've created, which are meant to simplify things. Now, this is the simple tool, which is sort of like our IoT reference framework, which allows us to have many views of the IoT value chain. And the value chain goes right through from the endpoint, the sensor, the device, through the gateways, connectivity, connection management, intelligence, application, user interface, users, service providers, and the actual solution, actual industries, and the application and the outcomes themselves. Now, you have to take an outcomes view of the Internet of Things, because it's so embedded between physical to virtual to physical. So if you don't take an outcomes view, you're just a technologist without knowing what the outcome is. You're a waste of, you're not actually helping. And this was not one attempt. This is a view of the many players in the ecosystems, whether they're integrators or solution vendors or IoT as a service, device as a service, IoT platform providers, network providers, hardware providers, retail distributors. They're all part of the IoT chain in different ways. So, and the data that comes from those devices and that's then married with other systems is part of that IoT ecosystem. And let me give you an example. We have a construction work stream. The construction industry is about a third of the market, a third of industry in Australia. It's huge, absolutely huge. It is ridiculously manual. It hasn't improved productivity in 30 years. In fact, has gone backwards in the last 2 to 3 years. It's massively constrained right now by materials and supply chain, and also by manpower and resources. And yet they're not tracking what they're doing automatically by where it is and how it is. So it's amazingly inefficient. It's incredibly inefficient. But the problem is that the way in which they set up major projects is every time it's a new one. It's a $100 million project. It's a 5-year program. It's a whole lot of new players, and the platforms and everything else to bring it all together doesn't exist or hasn't existed. That's now changing. The idea of pulling inputs about whether the driver's COVID tested, or there's fuel in the tank, or he's got the right device on the right I-beam on his truck, or the lights are synchronized so he can get through to the end place in the quickest way. All of those disparate systems are now being looked at and being federated in platforms and systems that now work into their operational systems. That's where the revolution's happening, massive revolution. But we're at the very early stages. It's unbelievably non-digitized. And if you want to choose another sector that's really badly non-digitized, health sector, appalling, utterly abysmal. So massive improvement to be done there, massive value to be generated, and we just don't have the extra money to do it, to just pay us to do that same old ways. Really interesting report that I've got. I've just stolen something out of it from McKinsey that just recently re-looked at the IoT markets around the world, but actually defined them not in the usual verticals like health, etc. They call them factories, human health, well, work sites, city, environments. And they mapped it against the use cases for IoT that had the biggest impact in their view over the next 10 years. And you'll see down the bottom, well, you won't probably see it, let me tell you. They've clustered IoT's use case categories from 1 to 10. And operations optimization is evidently today, and for the next 5 or 10 years, whatever the industry thinks is where the real bang for the buck is. And they've done it in, how many billions of value that it will generate. And so operations, so the top of the chart is operations optimization. Next is human productivity, then is health, then it's condition-based maintenance, then it's sales enablement. This is actually connecting production to sales and vice versa. Energy management, autonomous vehicles, environmental management, safety, security, product development, and inventory management. So there's a sort of a suite, covers pretty much everything. If I want to throw my 2 cents in, I think that they have completely underplayed the transition to net zero and climate adaptation in this. That's because they're speaking to a lot of people who were in their verticals, but there's another macro set of factors that will change where the real value will come out. IoT essential for reaching net zero. I wanted to make that big point. And a little while ago, the World Economic Forum did a study with IoT Analytics, and they analyzed 700 IoT projects, and they discovered, to their slight surprise, that 84% of them actually addressed or had the power to advance the UN sustainability goals because of what they were doing in their projects and the data they collected. And that was mostly not because they were trying to do that, but that was a sort of like a side benefit, i.e. they got a bit more productive, or they used their resources a bit better, which sort of triggered the idea, what if you actually tried to think about doing that? How much more powerful could it be? If you actually thought about IoT for good, rather than it was a dividend you didn't even think of when you started. So that's that. I just wanted to put that little data point out there because I think it's interesting, and there are a whole lot of other metrics around the value of that, which I don't think I need to tell you about, but suffice to say, measuring and understanding the circular effect of what we're doing is really, really important. A really interesting article came out, well, the ACCC presented a paper yesterday at a sustainability conference, and it talked about greenwashing. It talked about the idea that companies are saying they're doing it, but some aren't actually doing it, and they're saying it because it'll sell. And they're coming from the point of view of, oh, consumers are going to buy from a company that says that this is organic, but it's not, or this is they're net zero, but they're actually not, and that's misleading, and I get it. But I care also about the idea that they're not actually helping the planet. They're not actually helping to get to net zero. And how do we look at that, and how do we make it trackable, measurable, and therefore that we actually achieve our targets? And that's by measurement. So I think it's also mandatory for compliance, not just for how we do it, but also are we doing it? And that's going to be important for future trading of carbon credits and all that sort of stuff as well. Not to mention a ticket to entry for selling products into Europe. Now, a frightening set of statistics I want to put up that keep doing the rounds, but Australia keeps patting itself on the back saying we're fantastic at adopting technology, and the answer is no, we're not. We're terrible at adopting technology. We have some fantastic examples of good technology adopters and some leaders in some certain places, but in all the indexes, whether it's World Economic Forum, whether it's OECD, how much we spend on ICT, whether it's on the Tufts Index on what our digital momentum is, whether it's on the Harvard Economic Complexity Index, or whether it's on the IMD Digital Competitiveness and World Competitive Index, we regularly sit around about the 15th to the 20th in competitiveness stakes. And in terms of our momentum and our economic complexity and digital savviness, we're in the 80s. I mean, I mean, not in the 80s in the time frame, we probably are actually, but we're actually 80s in the ranking, around Namibia or something. We're really, really poor in some of the things that we do. And so I look at it, I try to do the half glass empty, half glass full view and say that's an amazing opportunity for us, but it's also a big threat that we need to address, which is how do we adopt it in a way that helps our economy and our society and the world that we want to be, and we need to get the conversation going much faster. So our chair just recently went to Europe, and industrial automation and automating processes is huge over there, as is sustainability. The conversation is nowhere near there in Australia, nowhere near it, and they're using digital to do it. So massive opportunities, but it all relies on us using data and collecting it and processing it. Okay, IoT the Barriers. So this is also from that McKinsey report that came out in November last year. So interestingly, when they came up with tailwinds, headwinds, and neutral, and sort of surprisingly, but not surprisingly, it isn't about the technology. The problem isn't so much the technology performance. It isn't even the perceived value proposition, which I find really interesting. And I discovered that during our State of the Nation event about 3 years ago, when people were constantly coming up with business cases that made sense, that paid back. And we kept wondering, why is it not actually happening? If it makes business sense, why wouldn't you do it? And indeed, the headwinds part is where the real problem is. And I've got a couple of slides on it later on, but I don't need to amp it up too much. But my gut feel is the number one reason is change management. The number one reason is people just don't want to change. They don't feel the need to change. It's going okay. Or even in the case of, I've got a few hospital examples where fantastic productivity improvement capability, but all the people wanted to do was just do what they were doing before, just using the data, but not actually changing their process. So it doesn't help if you don't change. So change is really hard. Now, that's exacerbated by lack of talent. And when I say lack of talent, lack of digital savviness. And I think part of the problem here in Australia is that we are, as a nation, not digitally savvy across the board. I mean, it's not just a lack of IoT engineers or people experts in sensors or in AI, but in the fact that in our everyday business, we don't think digital, that boards don't think digital, that we're not thinking digital. So it's a whole revolution around what digital means. Interoperability is an issue, of course, the idea of, you pick a dead end and then you find out you've got to change it, it's going to cost you again. Cybersecurity lingers all the time as an issue. I actually think people use it as the excuse. In my experience, people roll it out and then discover the security challenge afterwards. Or if they don't want to roll it out, they use security as the issue for not doing it. But it is, but I'm not saying it's not an issue, it's a huge issue. And privacy and confidentiality, absolutely, especially in the consumer space, is not actually preventing things from happening, by the way. Consumers are using devices without thinking about the consequences because otherwise they can't use it. They just tick the yes box. But this is an issue. It's certainly a compliance issue in Europe now. But the whole question of consent, fairness, is going to become bigger and bigger and bigger. And as products become more digitized and the services become more digitized, knowing what you're actually getting into is going to be an ACCC thing. They're going to hopefully protect consumers, and we're going to be in that land. Probably don't want to go any further than that. Technical barriers, standardization. So there's a lot of standardization happening right now, by the way. It hasn't really penetrated procurement in government circles much yet. That's part of the issue. That's part of the interoperability challenge as well. The Infrastructure Australia came up with a fantastic reform paper last year that said all big projects should be digital by default. That's the reason. Now we need to process cybersecurity. I mentioned this before. Lack of business alignment to IoT goals. For me, this is around the change management issue. This is what are the business goals first, and how does IoT support it rather than let's do an IoT project, and even worse, have an IoT project sitting in the innovation part of the business, but not in the line of business. That is just so endemic. It's ridiculous. Digital awareness of the leaders. And at a government level, we've been lacking to some degree in terms of national leadership in some of the issues. I think that's it really helps to focus energy in certain places so that we can garner our resources. We can't spread ourselves everywhere. So having clear strategy and clear goals that are national as well as aligned to what the states are doing is pretty important. We're heavily working on that. So and of course the talent gap is massive, and the moving of not just, I mean, the talent pipeline. I'm completely excited by young people, and every time I see some young person that's even at primary school with digital skills, I'm stunned. And yet how we actually transform our existing workforce is the big issue. I reckon that's the massive issue. And then finally, I just wanted to say, IoT Alliance, we're the peak organisation. We do events, we produce guidelines, we produce frameworks. We're all about increasing the conversation. We're all about sharing knowledge. We're about case studies. And so if you're interested, it's easy to join. But we also have documents you may be interested in that may help you. So reach out to us as well if you are. And that's my presentation, Michael.
Thanks, Frank. Thank you for that. There's certainly a lot to cover in the world of IoT. And as we were, I think, saying before this call, almost every one of these slides could have been a day seminar somewhere else. So well done compressing it all into quite a tight time frame. Just a reminder, put your questions in the Zoom Q&A if you do have any. We do have about 10 minutes left just to move through a couple. But Frank, I might kick off with one of my own. And I'm sure it's a question on everyone's mind at the moment, but those smart speakers, are they always listening? Can we trust them?
I don't think you can trust them, actually. I mean, we don't know if you can trust them. I think that's probably the better answer. So I think we have what we don't have is good contracts, good social contracts, and good accountability for providers of services around what they do with your data. I think that, and that's not supported by mechanisms for penalty if you fail too. So I think there's an issue there. There are certainly plenty of good players, but can you tell the difference between the good ones and the bad ones? Not really, not easily. So I think there's an issue there. I can see there's a question around security of device standards and secure by design, which is something very close to our heart. And there are, I'll tackle on two things. One thing that IoT Alliance has been pushing very hard since 2017 is the idea that we should have something that like a consumer trust mark for IoT devices. The consumers should buy them and know that they meet at least minimum security standards. And right now they don't, nor do the people selling it to them. And nor, to my chagrin, a number of the vendors who are selling it. And why do I know that? Because we've actually been trialing people against the ETSI minimum standard guidelines. And we discovered that some of the vendors who submitted didn't understand the guidelines. So evidently could not have met them. So we didn't even test them. So there's a bit of an issue in terms of understanding of what that even means, and a huge education program out in consumer land. So there's a lot to do. There's movement afoot. Government's heading in that direction, and international standardization is heading in that direction too. So, but the horse is bolting, and we got more bottable devices, more devices that are botted out there than you could imagine. So if anyone wanted to do a good DDoS attack, they could.
Well, obviously not inviting anyone to, but you did tick off on a couple of questions we had come through by security by design on that one. And I'm just wondering, what does it actually look? What will it actually look like? Do you think in an ideal world, if I go and buy my smart speaker in a couple of years' time and the IoT Alliance's wonderful device labeling policies out that say, well, what is it? Is it like a health star rating? Is it a rolling website? I'm just thinking as soon as you publish say this device is secure, the next day it's probably not. So
yeah, so the design of that is a big question. I can give you my personal opinions, and that is that consumers really should know it at the point of purchase. That there are very few people that actually go to the website and check it out. But if to do that is actually not easy, because it means you have to push that information to the distribution organization and the retailers, and they have to keep that. And so when they put in, it's got so much RAM, it needs to say and it passes this truck mark. Now, the question of whether it's a star rating system is another question, and the Singaporeans are pushing a star rating very hard. And I'm not against the star rating per se, because it works evidently pretty well in the energy management. It's just that it needs to be risk-based, and I'm not sure people understand risk. And so then there's a whole other question around, is a baby monitor more risky than your automated fridge? And the answer is yeah. But how do you categorize them? And should it be a 3 or a 4 and all that sort of stuff? That's a big job. So I'm pushing very hard for, let's get a minimum started, because so many aren't even at the minimum. And I could quote some frightening statistics about devices out there that are not minimum. And by the way, it's not just about the technology, it's about the installation process. So anecdotally, a quarter of the cameras that go into prisons are botted. And it's not because they couldn't be secure, it's just that they're installed with default passwords. Yeah. Stupid.
So if I'm in a prison, admin is the thing to try on the back end of the camera, is it? We had a question about the EU regulating and enforcing security by design. Do you think the industry in Australia can head that off and lead by themselves, or do you think it's going to require intervention?
Well, we need a lot of education. I mean, in a way that what the Europeans are doing is going to force the issue. So it's a compliance issue. So if you want to sell, you've got to do it. So that's that helps the change management process. Why do I have to change? I've lost a third of the market, I better change. So in a way, it helps. But the federal government's done a whole lot of work on critical infrastructure and requirements for that, the Essential 8, and a whole lot of risk management processes and secure by design principles. And so that's going to really drive change around all the prescribed critical industries, and there's 13 or something of them. And that includes telecoms and water and energy, etc. And so all the suppliers of that are all going to get into there. But because the Internet of Things has this funny permeable barrier where the data comes from everywhere and isn't necessarily recognized as being in infrastructure, it'll find its way in. So the secure by design sort of needs to go all the way to consumer devices eventually, and consumers have no idea about that.
No. And we had a good comment come through from Don that California's outlawed default passwords, which actually seems like a pretty good idea. So that might head off a few issues there. One thing I just wanted to touch on in terms of consumer education is that there does seem to be a bit of a lag. You hear a lot more about encryption, and people talk about, oh, my device is encrypted, and that's good. And so there's sort of that awareness that encryption is good, but then, as you know, there's another layer behind that, which is, well, who can actually decrypt it? Do you think there's going to be that challenge that buzzwords are going to get in there and into advertising, and how do you combat that?
Yeah, they're already in there. I mean, there's all these simplistic answers like, oh, yeah, I've encrypted it, therefore it's secure, or I've got blockchain, therefore it's secure, or something, which is all, helpful, but not necessarily solving the problem. And indeed, it's the actors along the way. And as you know, an IoT service is a whole suite of technologies and a whole suite of service providers delivering it. So yeah, somewhere that data is unpacked. So someone's got access to it. Whether that person is a secure person or not, we don't know. Who do they share it with? We don't know. And so there's a really interesting set of standards, and it's being driven by Europe again, around data provenance, which I find particularly interesting, which is, where did it come from? Where did it go through? What did they do to it on the way before it got to the end? Might actually start giving us some perception of, oh my God, by the time it got here, it was shared by 50 people I didn't even know it was supposed to be shared with, or that aren't in the approved list, or whatever that is. Who knows where that might go. But there's a long way to go in how you actually do that. But it goes all to the question of the trustability of the data itself. Yeah.
And always an ongoing challenge. So you touched on how far Australia is behind. I might make this the last question too, because we are running out of time, but and I'm sure it'll be a longer answer, but you touched on how Australia is lagging behind. How do we catch up?
We just need to have more conversations going around how we can use digital to improve outcomes, and recognize that we're not where we should be with the outcomes that we're getting. So I don't think we're urgent enough about our outcomes. I think we haven't been urgent enough about climate change. We haven't been urgent enough about transition to renewable energy. We haven't been urgent enough about being competitive. And so I think that that goes to a bigger question that isn't about IoT. It's about complacency and, you know, those questions about the lucky country and everything else not diversifying. So we're doing our bit in trying to get the conversations and making tools to make it easier. I think everyone has a role to play. And so building collaborations of collaborations is the only way. And so my theory is, if Australia could out-collaborate, we can make up the gap. We're small enough to be able to do that. Question is, do we have the will, and do we have enough leadership to do that? Those are the big questions.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you, Frank. We are running out of time, and we'll have to have you back at some stage to delve into some of these issues further. And I'll know to be a bit more specific and allocate a bit more time for some issues, because there's a lot to cover. But thank you for that. I'm just going to pop up a slide quickly with just our upcoming events as we draw the session to a close. So thank you again, Frank, for taking us through the world of IoT. And just to flag a couple of upcoming events for our .au members, we have a cybersecurity workshop with Cinch Security on the 18th of October. We also have an Adelaide networking event for our South Australian based members on the 26th of October. And auDA is pleased to once again support NetThing, Australia's Internet Governance Forum, on the 27th to the 28th of October. All those details are available on our website, including information on signing up as a .au member if you're not already, to stay informed on these and other upcoming events. Thank you again to Frank, and thank you all for your questions coming through today. Sorry we couldn't get to them all, but hopefully we'll have an opportunity to discuss them at a later date. Enjoy the long weekend, and we'll speak to you again soon. Thank you.